Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Megan Burrell and I'm your instructor this semester for Human Growth and Lifespan Development. Coming to you from my office in my home here outside of Washington, D.C. I'm really excited our class has started and that we're going to be working together over the next 7 weeks. This class is one of my favorites to teach. I've been teaching for 13 years and teaching the Lifespan Development course is my absolute favorite, so I'm excited to dig in with you guys all this term. Each week I'm going to post a video in the course at the beginning of the week. There's a couple of different reasons we're going to be doing this video. The first is that I just want you to have a sense of who I am, that I'm a real person behind the screen answering your questions and grading your work. I know sometimes it can be hard to feel connected in online courses, and so I'm hoping this video will help in that regard. The other reason we decided to post videos each week is just because students learn in lots of different ways. There's auditory learners and visual learners, and so it's my help by talking through some of the information each week that it'll just give you another way to think through the material and wrestle through the material that you're learning and reading about. So we're in week 1 and we're going to cover several different topics this week. So I'm going to briefly go through those and then I'll tell you what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of this video. The first thing we're going to talk about is using the scientific method to study lifespan development. When we think about the scientific method or science, often we think of the hard sciences like chemistry and physics. But there's real questions for us to dive into of how do we make a science of studying human development, how we grow and change over the lifetime. What does that mean? What does that look like? How do you study behavior? How do you study relationships in a scientific way? We'll be talking about that. The second thing we're going to talk about is Baltes' lifespan perspective. So Baltes is a researcher in the field of human development who did a lot of his work in the 70s, and he put forth this framework for us to understand how we grow and change throughout our lifetime. So his framework has 7 different tenets, and we'll be going through that this week. We'll be talking about other major theories of human development as well, including the work of Urie Bronfenbrenner. So I just wanted to take a minute to tell you how interconnected we all are in this world and in this field specifically. So my advisor in graduate school, her name is Nan Crowder, and her advisor in graduate school was actually Urie Bronfenbrenner. So that makes me Urie's academic grandchild and makes you his academic great-grandchildren because you're my students. So just know that even as you're reading about these scholars in your textbooks this semester, you're actually very connected to one of them, which is neat. We're also going to be focusing primarily on from conception to birth this week of the lifespan. And we're going to talk specifically about some of the genetic influences that are really important around the time of conception. And the last thing we're going to talk about is the nature-nurture debate, and that's where we're going to focus the rest of this video. So most people, even if they've never taken a formal psychology class or human development class, have heard about this idea of the nature-nurture debate. What influences who we turn out to be? Is it our biology, our hormones, our genes, our nature, or is it our nurture, our environment that we grow up in? So we're going to pull apart some of the complexities of this debate in the next few minutes. So let's begin this discussion. I want to tell you about these 2 twins named James Arthur Springer and his identical twin, James Edward Lewis. Jim and Jim were separated at birth and were adopted by separate families. And when they were reunited 40 years later, the similarities in their life was very striking. So let me just tell you a few of the things of ways that they were similar. They were both part-time sheriffs. They drove the same kind of car. They vacationed at the same beach in Florida. They both married women named Linda. Then they divorced Linda and they married women named Betty. Their sons had the same name, which was James Allen. They liked math but not spelling. They chewed their fingernails. They both enjoyed carpentry. They both put on 10 pounds the same year of their life. They both had headaches that began at 18 and used the exact same words to describe how their heads felt during headaches. The list goes on and on. Identical twins like the Jims provide researchers a fascinating look at the effects of nature and nurture on development. Their nature is exactly the same. Their biology, their genes were all identical, but their nurture was very different, their environment. Now, ethically, obviously, We cannot take twins and purposefully separate them to understand nature-nurture effects. But there have been multiple times throughout history where twins were adopted in separate families. And there is a group of researchers at the University of Minnesota who has taken to study twins like the Jims and other twins that were identical but reared apart in order to help us understand some of the influences of nature and nurture. So let's break this debate down a little bit. When we're talking about nature, what do we mean? Nature refers to the influence of heredity on development, or, in other words, our biologically based predispositions. So by conducting research on the Jim twins, as well as examining other twins who are identical and twins who are fraternal, researchers have been able to identify several different traits that have a very strong biological basis. So, intelligence, your verbal ability, your scholastic achievement, memory, where you fall on the introversion-extroversion scale, how conscientious and how agreeable you are all traits that they find have very strong genetic components. And they've also been able to find some disorders that are very strongly linked to our biology or our genes, such as depression, autism, Alzheimer's, schizophrenia, and alcoholism. There's an entire field of science devoted to understanding the influence of heredity and environment on human development, and that's the field called behavioral genetics. Now, one of the things that behavioral geneticists study is a term called the heritability of different traits. So when I use that word heritability, it refers to the variance in a trait that is due to genetics. So I had just told you that intelligence is a trait that is very highly heritable, or it has a very strong biological component. So the most recent estimates and studies put the heritability of intelligence to be about 80 to 86%. So what that means is that biology largely determines our intelligence. However, the heritability of intelligence is not 1, it's 80 to 86%. So what that means is that environment has a small piece to play in what one's final IQ is. So what does that mean? How do we think about that as researchers? So with respect to intelligence, what that means is that we kind of think that people are born with about a 10-point range of intelligence. So that might be, average intelligence is about 100. So let's say someone is born with their intelligence range from about 100 to 110. If they have a really supportive environment and lots of intellectually stimulating toys and books and really great schools, they might be more likely to be towards the top of that range. But if they don't have that kind of stimulating intellectual environment, they might be more towards the bottom of the range. So that just is a way to think about some of the ways that biology and environment factor into a trait like intelligence. Let's move on to nurture. When we're talking about nurture in that nature-nurture debate, what do we mean? Nurture refers to the forces in the environment that influence development. The environment modifies or enhances which traits we are genetically predisposed to having. So when you think about the work of Urie Bronfenbrenner that you're going to be reading about this week, his framework is set up to help us understand different layers of how environments influence. So we have microsystems, mesosystems, exosystems, macrosystems. They're all different layers in our environment that influence how we end up developing over time. So are there any traits that they have found that tend to be primarily influenced by the environment? And the answer is yes. So, for example, one can clearly see that when an infant is born, they have the ability to learn any language in the world. But within the first 6 months of life, they start tuning in to the sounds that they're hearing in the language that's around them, spoken by their primary caregivers in their home. So by the age of 6 months or so, they find that the window begins to close as infants begin to only focus on certain sounds, and they lose that ability where they could have learned any language at birth. By 6 months, they've already honed into certain sounds that they're hearing in their home. And so, language development is something that is very tied to environment. So, taking both of those things, what we learned about nature and what we learned about nurture, what's the answer to the nature-nurture debate? Is nature more important or is nurture more important? The reality is that nature and nurture are intimately and hopelessly interconnected with respect to human development. So, that said, one final term for you to take away from this video, it's called epigenesis or epigenetics. This refers to the notion that development is the result of ongoing exchanges between nature and nurture. Genes have an influence on our environments we experience, and at the same time, a person's environments can then cause certain genes to be expressed at certain times compared to others. The field of epigenetics tries to understand that interaction between nature and nurture. This process affects the physical structure of our brains and pulling apart certain effects of only nature or only nurture is very complex because of all of these interrelationships. So taking a step back, I took my first developmental psych class in the year 2000. So that means I have been in this field for almost 20 years. And if I were to summarize one thing about human development, I would say that human development is incredibly complex. The more that we learn, the more we realize that we don't really know. And this nature-nurture debate is the perfect example of that, ways in which our nature and our nurture are so intertwined and affecting each other to produce the traits that you see in people today. So I'll end here. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me this week if you have any questions or concerns. This morning I spent a while posting on the discussion boards, the introduction discussion board, reading your biographies and getting to know you, which was great. If you haven't had a chance to post your bio, make sure that you do that today and interact with your classmates there. And I look forward to reading your posts once you guys start going on the discussions this week. It's been great talking to you, and I look forward to next week when I'll be back.